Welcome to the second episode of Liberation Through Love, because where love leads, healing can emerge. Creating this podcast is an act of love from Emerge Center Against Domestic Abuse. We believe that where we are safe to heal, we are free to be. My name is Anna Harper. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Executive Vice President at Emerge. Every day throughout this organization, there are so many informal, heartfelt conversations about our work, our love for our community, and stories of the pain and resiliency of survivors that never leave these walls. We also know that folks across our community are supporting each other with navigating experiences with abuse, violence, oppression, and trauma, and are creating healing spaces that work for their community. We hope this podcast will become a container for the love, healing, and brilliance, and serve as a tool to help bridge all of the critical work and leadership across our community. When we are in loving, healthy relationship, we can work together to heal and transform our communities. Today's conversation is in partnership with April Ignacio. April Ignacio is a mother, advocate, and survivor. She is a member of the Tono Atom Nation, and April is the co-founding member of Indivisible Tono, an organization that provides opportunities for civic engagement. April has been a part of the Arizona Study Committee for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls since its inception. She was recently appointed by Governor Hobbs to serve on the new Arizona State Missing and Murdered Indigenous Peoples Task Force and help lead the effort to establish a local task force in Pima County focused on addressing the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous people. In our first episode of Liberation Through Love, we shared information about a community-based model of understanding violence. We talked at length about the connection between what we call systemic and community conditions and the prevalence of domestic abuse. In fact, domestic abuse is not a problem of individual people or a problem of certain relationships, but it is a product of historical, systemic, and community conditions. This is to say that often our community's response or lack of response to abuse and violence is the very thing that teaches and reinforces the violence. While we will always focus on providing individual support to survivors, and to those causing harm so that they can be safer, we also know that we must work to untangle the roots that hold violence in place and return power to those impacted by the violence. The movement of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls is becoming more known across the country with the help of social media. There are many layers and jurisdictional laws that are outdated. The lack of resources, including access to Amber Alerts and 911, are all factors in rural and reservation areas where Native women are being murdered at a rate of 10 times higher than the national average. According to the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence, 1 in 3 Native women reports having been raped during her lifetime. The United States Government Accountability Office reports that Native people are at least twice as likely to be raped or sexually assaulted as other races in the United States. Most times, it feels like no one is paying attention and no one is connecting the dots. This violence has its roots in colonial history, starting with Columbus's 1492 expedition. We cannot discuss ending violence against Native women without addressing the intersection of colonization, internalized oppression, and centuries of attempted genocide and the impact on the lives of Native women. This is a huge concept to unpack, and there are many nuances to understanding it all. And so today will not be a complete conversation and will likely only scratch the surface. With that, I want to begin by asking you, April, to please introduce yourself more fully to our listeners and share about your work to address this issue.
Skikdash, Anyap Jiggy, April Ignacio, Komshkurwawasik Jikshan, Komshkurwawasik Giham, Amajid. Thank you for having me. I am April Ignacio, and I am the co-founder for Indivisible Tono, As you mentioned, we're a grassroots community-based organization that focuses on civic engagement beyond voting. So our belief is that voting is the least you can do, and how it impacts our communities directly by not understanding and knowing the issues in our community. So we spend a lot of time providing education to our communities about laws that will eventually affect us, and how to prepare and sort of unpack these decisions that get made by the people we elect. So I'm also am a lone parent to 6. So I have 6 children. My oldest is 26. She lives in Washington. Attends Northwest Indian College. She's in the STEM field. My number 2 is Anna. She just finished her first year of law school at the University of Arizona. My number 3 is Micah. He's 18. He's trying to figure things out. And then I have a 9-year-old named Vine, 8-year-old named Trudell, named after John Trudell, and then the end to my legacy is Thorpe. He's 7 years old, and he's named after Jim Thorpe, the greatest athlete that ever lived. So I have been organizing in my community since I was a teenager. It's been very, it's been very interesting, but I also want to mention that I was raised by a single parent who, and because of the way that I was raised, I see things maybe just a little bit differently. And I grew up on the west side of the Tohono Nation in San Simon, and the west side is considered like the more traditional side. It's very rural. There were maybe less than 100 people in our community. And so the way that I was raised, and because I was raised in a single parent household, the village took care of my brothers and I, so that my mom could work. And so if you've ever heard that saying, it takes a village to raise a child, that was literally my life. And that's how I grew up in community, and that's how I understand community. So because of the job my mom had, we were left quite a bit with the village, and women in the village took care of me and my brothers, so that my mom could work. And the reason why I talk about this is because it's very unique, and a lot of communities don't have that, where you center the children in the community. And so it's with that same concept that I raise my children. There's I lean heavily on my community to help me raise my children. So my children also belong to the community. Right. So it's very unique in the way that I was raised, and I think about those support systems that were maybe not family. But I always tell people, like, if it wasn't for my friends, I'd feel like an orphan, because that's how important building relationships are to me and to Indivisible Tohono. So we create, rebuild, foster relationships within our community. And it's a lot of hard work, and I don't mean hard work of seeing the larger picture, longevity, and sort of reimagining the world we want our children to live in. So, I mean, that's just like something that we believe, Indivisible Tohono believes, is that we have the inherited right to fight as hard as we can in spaces where there is no voice for us. So we do spend a lot of time infiltrating spaces where people like us aren't there. And so we build our ways from inside out, if that makes sense. It's a different way to navigate through community, and sometimes there are no spaces for people like us, so we have to bring our own chair with us. And that has been pretty successful in the last few years with all of the work that we do. When we center we call them pillars. So this is the foundation that we work on, and one of them is anti-violence. That includes missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, civic engagement, community building, land back. That includes teaching people how to give us land, giving them the technical and legal language to will their land back in a very strategic way that includes lawyers. So we are building something extremely different, and
yeah, and I really, I think about that story you told about being raised in the community, and it makes me, for our listeners who maybe haven't met April before or read her pieces or listened to her talk, I want to let you know that we have a couple of pieces up on our website that April wrote during Domestic Violence Awareness Month in previous years. And one of the first ones that you wrote, you talked a lot about the message of don't let anyone take you, and being raised to believe, right, that if you aren't mindful of your surroundings, that someone could take you, and that those were the teachings from the community, and that you passed that to your children. And I also recall being told that as a child, as a little girl. So I'm wondering if you can elaborate on that, because I really see that as being tied, those sort of core messages, right, that Indigenous children, Native children receive are not by accident, and they're driven by the historical context and the current context of all of our relatives that are missing. So can you elaborate on that piece a little?
It's one of those messagings, and I guess that's trauma, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's built in trauma, internalized trauma of teaching young kids teaching them that there's how is it to be alert, to be alert, and to be very aware of your surroundings. It's the equivalent of women who when they're parking in garages, park near the stairs, they park near an exit, they don't park near a minivan. It's that awareness that Indigenous children, brown children learn, Black and brown children learn at a very young age of how to survive. It's this, it's hard to it's hard to actually verbalize how don't let them take you, don't let anyone take you, that's a message that mothers give their children of when they're not in plain sight. Right. If you're going into the store, and then just reminding them, don't let anyone take you, I mean, and it's so we unpack that, right? What does that mean? Don't let anyone take you. It's that cognizant understanding that it is so real for children to go missing, for brown people to go missing, And so how do we like, and we're already instilling that into our children. So it's a coping mechanism to make sure that that our children are completely aware of their surroundings.
Right.
And it's like, as an adult, like, I recognize the trauma that I'm already in, the trauma you're enduring on children to have to be afraid.
Right. Well, and is it trauma, or is it the reality, right, of safety in our communities for Black and brown children, and the lack of structure within our communities to keep them safe otherwise? And I say that because I'm gonna, just for our listeners here, I'm gonna read this to make a point. But you're like, it could be trauma, right? It could be trauma. It could be just sort of like the way we're raised, or it could be really rooted in reality.
Right.
And so when I gave a couple of stats in our opening intro, but I'm going to just list off. We have the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence, the United States Government Accountability Office, the Department of Justice, RAIN, the Rape, Incest, and Abuse National Network, Amnesty International, the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, the National Indigenous Resource Center, all cite similar statistics about the rates of violence and lack of support and policy to address safety for Indigenous people. And in fact, 34% of Native women are raped in their lifetime. In some communities, there's research that 86 to 96% of the abuse is committed by non-Indigenous perpetrators. Indigenous youth are twice as likely to be forced into sex as white youth. And one study found that 22% of Indigenous women and 15% of Indigenous men experience childhood sexual abuse. The National Crime Information Center reported that in 2016, there were 5,712 reports of missing Indigenous people. And that was thought to be an undercount due to the lack of data collection by cities and the federal government. And so, again, I could go on and on about the reality. And so those teachings and those messages are really rooted in the reality. And it just kind of makes me think about all the work that you have done in your community to make visible this issue, because here's all of these stats being collected on a national level, and yet it often feels like people don't know.
Yeah.
People don't know Pima County is, what is Pima County? Second or third in the nation for missing and murdered people. Is that right?
Well, it's Tucson. The city of Tucson is, and then Arizona is number 4, depending on who you talk to. So just locally in the state of Arizona, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, you have 1,100 children who are currently missing in the state of Arizona. So yeah, I mean, it is real. It is real. I just think that, you're talking to a toddler, a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old, and you're telling them, don't let anyone take you. What that does to a child, and that's just.
Tell us about your collecting of stories.
So in 2017, the Tohono Nation dedicated the Thaka Field. Thaka Field is named after my mom, Verna and Enos, and a lot of the people and the women in our tribe, I credit my mom, Verna, from bringing back this traditional game. So she's known as the Thaka Lady. They dedicated a field the size of a football field, so that there would be a dedicated space for Thaka. And she was the traditional games coordinator for the tribe for well over 30 years before her passing. And but it was the first time there's a concentrated space and a platform for people in our community. And so the idea that we are also a part of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and at the time the focus was on women and girls, because of the national movement of MMIWG that started in Canada. So for me, it was more about connecting the dots, right? And providing examples that we're not exempt from this movement, and that we are also affected by this. But before then, there was like a lot of, roundabout, but there was nothing pinpointing of like, this is what it is, this is what it looks like. And we are not exempt. We are not exempt from MMIWG. And so the conversations within the community began about MMIW, and of course I know there's like a definition of what MMIWG looks like, and it's the result of violence. So how the violence in our communities perpetuated mostly by men, and how individuals have lost their lives or have simply just disappeared and have gone missing. And there are stories in our community about women who've lost their lives to violence, so it wasn't that hard, because we the memory of those women are they're still alive and well, and so I just started talking to people in my community about this platform we have, and how could we sort of provide a larger visual image for our community to see that we're not exempt from this. So the idea was to do a art installation. So I'm an artist. It's what I do. It's what I love. And if I can't create, I probably will die. And so the visual was to utilize red dresses. There's a red dress campaign that was started in by Jamie Black, who is a Métis artist from Canada. And what they would do is they would hang red dresses in Vancouver to begin the conversation of MMIW, because at that time Canada was exploding with missing women, and they have a highway there called the Highway of Tears. And so she utilized these red dresses for Indian communities. The red dresses, the color red is very symbolic, and so it's the one color that spirits can see. And so by hanging these red dresses in public spaces, it for Indigenous peoples is very powerful. And so she would hang these red dresses in public spaces and public parks, in front of public libraries, so that to begin that conversation. And so it was inspired by Jamie Black to hang red dresses and to get a count of how many that we knew of at the time who had lost their lives to violence or had gone missing. And so what I did was I coordinated with the Thaka teams, because I'm now the Thaka coordinator, the traditional games coordinator for my tribe.
We're up to 3 jobs now.
Yeah. And I coordinated with the teams. We have about 20 teams, and there's about 15 to 20 women on each team. So we average around 300 women who participate in this, the largest, it's like the Super Bowl tournament for our tribe, to provide red dresses, and they can do it any way they want to. And so I would install these red dresses over the weekend, and then maybe talk to a couple of family members and see if they could provide pictures about some of our victims, the surviving family. And so when those discussions were happening in the community, it sort of snowballed into like, don't forget so and so. Do you have so and so? And so it was actually the work of community who was like, you need to talk to so and so, and what about this one, and what about this one? And so or those people would then contact other family who would then contact me. And so it snowballed into something that I wasn't necessarily trying to do. And then from 2017 and 18 was the art exhibit. I had met with probably 36 families. And so I want to be clear that this was not research. It wasn't intended to be like a nosedive into the lives of families. It's a very heavy work to work with families and them feeling like they need somebody to tell their story to. So that was a long process of probably 2 years and over 40 stories, 40 families, over coffee and smokes, cries, tears, memories, and all of those things. So like it was very heavy for me to do that work, and I look back at how many stories I was carrying, and trying to find ways to release them, has been quite a journey. Because it was all unintentional.
Well, and that's sort of the, when I think about how I met you and Emerge came to be in partnership with Indivisible Tono, it was, somewhere around 2019, I believe. Right. And really trying to make this connection in the community, that the work that you were doing to bring these stories into the light, to create that platform for families, and all it's as healing work, right? I hear you. It's not research, it's healing work. And I think sometimes we're too focused on counting people as opposed to humanizing that experience. And so one of the things I've really appreciated about our partnership is that we're focused on healing, and as defined by the community. So I'm wondering if we can kind of like pick up there in the story around how you see the healing work that you have been doing in community related to the numbers of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. How do you see that being tied to the larger issue of domestic abuse that saturates our communities, and all the work that you've done to help connect that dot, right? Because I see it as a progression of dots, right? And that it might seem like this is a problem of Indigenous communities, right? Or Native people, when really it's embedded in a much bigger picture of violence. And even in that bigger picture of violence, when we think about domestic violence, typically we're not considering Native communities and what the dynamics look like there. We're not thinking about Black communities. We're thinking about mainstream communities, right? The typical image that pops into your head when you think about domestic violence. So maybe you can share some about why you decided to invest in this partnership with Emerge and help connect that dot to the bigger issue of domestic abuse.
there's a couple of things. In understanding, there's a couple of things I guess I should also mention that in a lot of the statistics that we hear of, these are lived experiences of so many people, that how do you separate the community from the person? So I'll take myself for instance. I was raised in violence. I know what it's like to feel scared to go home. I know what it's like to fear what's going to happen to my mom. And so the community protected me and my brothers from that. And so because we were raised in violence, the heightened alertness of understanding our surroundings only to be subjected to it as an adult. And so you see those cycles of violence that we sort of inherit. And even though we can name it, I think in the community is like the acknowledgement. Acknowledging and accepting that this is what our community overall looks like. So my mom's way out of violence was when she was able to get a home. So we talk about housing, how housing is tied to a lot of survivors and whether or not they make it out alive. For my mom, that was how she was able to make it out alive, and that's how we were able to be safe, was because she finally had a home for herself and she could get out. So all of those things you recognize as an adult, right? But when you're young, you just this is life. This is just life. This is what it is. And so when we look at the acknowledging it in our community that this affects our mental being, this affects our state of being, how do you heal from that? So the really great thing about working with Emerge is finding other strategies that we may overlook. So MMIW is a men's issue. It is a men's issue. However, women carry this work because there's no one trying to carry this work. And so we believe that. IT believes that MMIW is a men's issue, and we will carry it for them until they get caught up. And so this is why we have shifted our strategy in how we address MMIWG in our community. Is we do a lot of men's work. And so that partnership with Emerge has been groundbreaking, not only for us, but it's a new way of acknowledging the problem and then finding a curriculum that is solution-based and taking those uncomfortable steps in our community to hold our hand back and pull our men forward. So there's this idea of, in society today, in culture today, that we can just throw people away. And it's a very, we see that everywhere we go, but Indigenous communities, these people are a part of your community, so dealing with these issues is very important, but we've gotten away from that as well. We're not exempt to how society changes. And so when we talk about healing, it's acknowledging that there is a problem, finding a solution, and creating a strategy in our community that is uncomfortable, but it's also safe. And so that's where that partnership with Emerge is. It gave us the it was somebody else telling us that what we were thinking and how we were feeling and the way we were moving, even though it was completely different from how domestic violence is a reactive programming of like, no, you got it right. So it was kind of like the thing we needed to reassure us that the way that we were moving towards men's work, because I have to look at, I even though we have to collect data, we look at the data. And so like in our tribal court systems, 90% of our court cases are domestic violence. And so then you see the high rate of women who are losing their lives, and then like there's multiple layers of it, but it comes back down to men.
Right.
And who is perpetuating the violence.
Right.
And are these men being held accountable, not through the justice system, but in our communities? And if they're not, how do we teach them? And without it being led by a woman, that has been very challenging because of the way that we have been conditioned through this Western lens of patriarchy. And so how do we sort of take a few steps back to reevaluate the entire situation and the systems that are basically designed for us to fail? So IT, we took all of those steps back and looked at the statistics in tribal courts, seeing how many cases are domestic violence cases, and these domestic violence also includes family violence, and how those and the setup, recreating a system that works for everyone.
Right.
So that partnership with Emerge has been very important, because Emerge is the only it is the only program, it's the only center that is doing men's work that we have a partnership with.
Right.
There may be other entities that do men's work, but we don't have those relationships with them. And so it has been very mind-blowing that one. And the strategy is different for doing men's work and holding men accountable. And that means not throwing them away. Reteaching them consistently, and, having the patience, because we want a better community to live in.
Yeah. Well, and, I think for Emerge, right, it means that we can keep doing what we have always done, and that has gotten us here, right? And here is, again, all the statistics I read off, all the realities for these families that have never been humanized, that are trying to remember all the names of the women to make sure they get mentioned, right? That there's like, when you think about domestic violence and that work, we have to complicate how we think about that work. And we have to make space to understand that it's not a singular issue, that it is deeply connected to all of the violence that saturates our communities, right? When we're talking about gun violence, we're talking about gangs, we're talking about youth on the streets, and what violence looks like in Native communities, and how there is a deep tie to how that manifests in our homes then, right? And surrounds our children. And that is domestic violence. That is the work to heal that. And I know that in those community conversations, for a lot of families, just sort of in my observation, it was having the opportunity to say it, and to name how it hurts, where it hurts, why it hurts, that just that act alone, people had never done that. And right, and you have to first name it,
right,
and look at it and sit with it and visit it before you can begin to consider, how do I make this different? And I feel like that's the work that y'all have facilitated for years. in your community, and now you've attached it to this like a what I would sort of name as like a system strategy, like your work on the task force, your work on the study committee, right? Can you talk about how what's the intersection between that grassroots healing work and the ways you're pressing and pushing on these larger systems to acknowledge this issue?
I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that systems can't pivot. So community can pivot. They can change. They can move in space. They can say things that systems can't say. And so community is a safer space for Indigenous people because systems cannot pivot. So when we think of how things don't change in systems, it's because there's either the lack of leadership, lack of training, or the creative thought processes to move where your community is moving and change with your community. So like if something isn't working for your community, those systems in place need to learn how to pivot so that it works for everybody. So that doesn't happen in community. And so I think that is why community organizations are far more successful and will be far more successful than law enforcement, like the law enforcement entities. So because there's that black and white, right? Communities are gray, like there's no it's not black and white.
Right.
And so when you think of the laws that are put in place and you think about families who don't receive justice, and what does justice look like? And so if you're working in the law enforcement community, you're talking about the law. You're talking about a procedure. You're talking about these are the next steps. You're talking about, you're talking about red tape, and you're talking about bureaucracy. You're talking about what's politically correct. And so I think that's the conversation that I'm able to provide for a lot of these systems in place. Because if you're going to work with MMIP, you have to be able to work with the law enforcement community. And that doesn't just mean the police. That's like a very small part of it. It's the foundation. It's the structure of law enforcement all the way up to our elected leaders who put these judges in place. And so it's all interconnected. And so for me, again, it's just connecting the dots.
Right.
So this is a community issue, and why should people care about that in the city of Tucson or in the state of Arizona is because that tells you how safe our communities are. And so if Tucson and Arizona are number 3 and 4 in the country, that tells you how safe we are.
Right.
Or how safe it isn't for marginalized group of people. And so that should be the red flag of why you should care about this issue. It is not just like an Indigenous issue. It's not just an issue because you're on Indigenous land. It should be an issue for you on the safety of the community. Right. So when you do MMIWG work, MMIP work, understanding you have to be able to work with the law enforcement community because it's larger. So we have systems in place. Systems need to change. The only people who can change those systems, those people who have those lived experiences, or those people who are advocates of surviving families. And so it's with those survivors in mind that the work continues. Right. So that their lives are remembered, and then also so that those families know that whatever justice looks like to you can be achievable by helping pivot the system. And so all of this has just sort of helped IT Indivisible Thano and our community and the state of Arizona to sort of get a sliver of information to change these systems, because the infrastructure needs to be built. So it's tangible items that you can see where systems can change. So Pima County, City of Tucson, is the only municipality and the only county in the United States that has a MOU and an IGA with the neighboring tribes. So why is that important? Because we talk about MMIP and some of the issues related to jurisdiction. These MOUs, IGAs with the county and the city with the neighboring tribes help flesh out some of those jurisdictional laws that may in the past prevented them to be able to work collectively together. So that's something that's groundbreaking. That's something that's happening here. That's something that we can hold our elected officials accountable to the community when for Native voters right now, like it's, election season, their number one topic is MMIW justice. And so if you have candidates who are not talking about MMIW, MMIG, or MMIP, those are not your candidates.
Right.
Because this is such a large issue for Natives in the United States. It tells you how much your candidates know about the community. And because it's such a large deal, like Pima County moving forward in this, the city of Tucson moving forward in this, and tribes have already recognized that this is a large issue that isn't, governments are not being held responsible to.
Right.
And so, I mean, and I think in a lot of ways it's more so important that we have that we are not reactive to a lot of the cases that are unfortunately coming.
Right. Yeah, I really appreciate how you made that connection between the working communities and the need to press and pivot systems, and how that power generates from the community, right? And that often we're waiting for people that are in these leadership roles, elected roles, to do something about a problem, when really the power comes from the community to press them to do so. And so, I really, there's so much more that we could keep digging into. And I know I said at the beginning we were going to scratch the surface. And so we might need to do another episode to really dig in on some of the policy work that's happening, especially as that local task force gets up and running. But before I close us out, I just want to ask you, if you have any other last words, things you want to ask of the community in support of these families and the work that you're doing.
We need you to register to vote. We need you to be civically engaged. I talk quite a bit about MMIP, MMIW, missing and murdered Indigenous peoples, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And so I go straight to the talking points, right? And I think that there are a lot of really great individuals and organizations who are working on these issues in Arizona. I think it's important for our listeners to remember that there's nowhere in Arizona that doesn't leave the footprint of Indigenous nations that have always been here. And so to keep that in mind, learning about the Indigenous peoples who travel and migrate, and because they have always been here. We have a word in O'odham that means juk, and that means rain. That's the name of what we call rain, but it's also the pronunciation for, it also is defined as the south. And so the people who come from the south are called Chukam. We call them, those are the migrants who come from down south. And Chukam means those who are coming from the rains. And so it's within this understanding of that we, number one, we don't own the land. We belong to the land.
I keep thinking about like where are the bodies of all of the women and girls that have gone missing, right? They're embedded in the earth somewhere.
I think we just need to acknowledge that femicide that's happening in Mexico and how high the rate of numbers are for missing women, murdered women in Mexico, and those are our relatives. And a lot of times, we don't include them.
Right.
But we have a word for the people who migrate across, because they've always migrated. In the mix of all this political rhetoric that we hear, that there's no place in Arizona that doesn't have the footprints of Indigenous people, and understanding that those high rate of numbers in Mexico coexist with the United States and Canada. And I don't want those of you who are listening to create these subconscious borders in how violence affects all of us, and how it's all interrelated into what your community looks like.
Yes.
And so I want to leave that with like one of the last thoughts of subconsciously challenging yourself to keeping those stories and those people in your mind, while we're going to hear political divisiveness continue, and that these are mothers, these are daughters, these are sisters, and they all deserve justice.
I want to thank you, April, for all of your labor and work to build safety in our community, and for giving life to the idea that when we can shift our understanding about the root causes of violence, we can create new patterns of behavior. And that allows survivors to heal and find safety in a loving community. At Emerge, we meet at the intersections of our journeys to metabolize trauma, create change amongst ourselves and our families, and grow in a world that centers and honors the humanity of all survivors. Join us as we move forward and continue along the trajectory of shaping innovative, reparative, and holistic community solutions. Thank you for listening, and please like this podcast and share it.